The night Aunt Sa was buried, the house in Saigon was completely empty. Yet Mrs. Ba, the neighbor, still saw a woman open the gate and walk in. It wasn't a fleeting glance. It was the shadow of a tree cast on the street, mistaken by old eyes for a human figure. It wasn't some strange woman passing through the alley, head bowed, wearing a dark coat, whose face the memory of old age automatically morphed into a familiar one. Mrs. Ba clearly saw her walk in from the head of the alley, slowly, with that exact slight tilt of the shoulders that belonged to her. The woman the whole neighborhood called Aunt Sa. She had watched that silhouette for years, from the time Aunt Sa was still healthy. Walking past her house on the way back from the market with bags of vegetables, smiling and chatting, to her later days when she went out less and her steps grew heavier, yet still kept that habit of slightly bowing her head whenever she passed someone else's gate. A habit ingrained deep in her bones. It was near midnight. The alley's lights had dimmed. The houses packed closely together were shut tight, leaving only a few streaks of yellow light spilling from upper floor windows, bleeding onto the street in frail streaks like dying candlelight. The scent of a Saigon alley at night is distinct. The smell of cement, still radiating heat after a sun-baked day, the smell of sewer water mixed with wet leaves, the scent of someone's late-night incense, the lingering aroma of cold rice and frying oil trapped in a kitchen. The wind blew through the tangled web of power lines overhead, making them vibrate ever so faintly, sounding like someone pulling a thin thread through the dark. Mrs. Ba couldn't sleep. She stood on her balcony catching the breeze, one hand on the railing, the other pulling her collar tight against the slight midnight chill. At that age, a person might forget where they put their keys, forget whether they turned off the stove, forget what they talked about just that afternoon, but they don't easily forget the gait of a neighbor who had walked back and forth past their door for years. She saw Aunt Sa stop in front of Yai's gate, standing still for a few seconds, like someone returning from a long journey, taking a moment to look at the house she once lived in. Then she reached out and opened the gate. What Mrs. Ba would remember forever afterward wasn't just the silhouette, but the fact that the gate made absolute sound. No click of the lock, no screech of the hinges, no scrape of metal against the core concrete floor. The gate just swung open in total silence, so effortlessly it was as if the house had recognized the one returning and unlocked itself to let her step inside. Aunt Sa walked across the small courtyard, stepped up to the front door and disappeared into the darkness within. No lights were turned on, no one was called out to. No sound of footsteps, no sound of the door closing. There was only a void of darkness swallowing that familiar silhouette, as if it had been waiting for her to come back all along. Mrs. Ba stood watching for a while longer, noting that the house remained pitch black. She found it a bit strange but wasn't afraid yet, because she didn't know Aunt Sa had died. She didn't know that earlier that afternoon down in our dark dirt had been hastily shoveled over her coffin in strict accordance with religious rites. She didn't know that Vaisai's family was still stranded on the road back to Saigon because their vehicle had broken down at the Vam Kong Bridge. She didn't know that the house across the alley was entirely devoid of people. She merely mumbled, "Oh, did Ha come back first?" before turning back inside, closing the balcony door and trying to go back to sleep. But that night, as she recounted later, she couldn't sleep deeply. Every time she closed her eyes for a moment, she saw that silhouette stopping in front of the gate, saw the door opening without a sound, saw the pitch-black house across the alley, looking like a mouth clamped shut, hiding something inside. The next morning when the group returned from Anjan, everyone was so exhausted their faces were gray. From lack of sleep. From the long journey from having just buried a loved one while their minds still refused to believe she was truly lying beneath the earth. Mrs. Ba walked over and asked naturally, "I saw her come back first yesterday. Why are you all just getting back now?" That question dropped into the courtyard like a small stone tossed into a basin of freezing water. The person carrying bags stopped. The person opening the door froze. Vi's grandmother, who had just been helped out of the car, stood dead still for a beat. Vi's mother looked at Mrs. Ba, her face still exhausted, her eyes still red, but in just 1 second, that exhaustion was replaced by an entirely different kind of chill. No one in the yard spoke loudly anymore. Even the noise of the traffic out in the alley seemed to quiet down. Vi's mother said very softly, "Sister Ha passed away, Mrs. Ba. We buried her yesterday afternoon down in Anjan. There was no one in the house last night." Mrs. Ba's face drained of color. Her hands gripped the gate, her eyes looking past everyone's shoulders into the dark void inside the house, as if searching for the footprints of the woman from the night before. Initial certainty on her face crumbled very slowly, giving way to a delayed terror, the kind of terror that only crashes down when you realize the thing you saw at midnight was never supposed to be there. She stammered, "Then last night, what did I see?" No one answered because in Vi's family that wasn't the first question, nor was it the last. Before Ansao returned as a soundless shadow, before the scent of agarwood rose in the middle of a motel room in Chow Dock, before Vi's mother heard the words, "Yes I know, Chiaba," from someone who was supposed to be in the ground, Vi's family had another door, a door in Anjiang. A door that grandmother had reached out to open, only to collapse right on the threshold, as if someone had been standing inside, waiting for over 20 years just to violently rip the voice right out of her throat. Vi grew up in that Saigon house living with that feeling. By day the house was always full of voices. Mornings brought the clatter of her mother pulling the iron gate, the slap of her younger brother's sandals running down the stairs, the bubbling of a boiling pot in the kitchen, the clink of a spoon against a glass, voices calling out from the upper floor, and her grandmother's dry cough after every windy afternoon. There was the sound of motorbikes out in the alley, the neighbors turning on the radio, the bread vendor calling out as he passed, someone arguing over a parking spot, kids running by before being scolded and called back by their mothers. All of these were the sounds of an ordinary family, warm even. A house with the elderly, with children, with meals, scoldings, laughter, and grumbling over trivial things. But in V's memory, the more crowded it was, the more the house felt like it was trying to conceal some hollow void inside. That void was most apparent after 9 at night, when the neighbors started shutting their doors, when the voices in the house thinned out, when the living room was lit only by a weak yellow bulb, when the stairs grew just a shade darker. Then during the day, when the ground floor bathroom became a square of cold white light in the middle of the house. There were nights when Vi was lying in bed, suddenly feeling that the house was too quiet. So quiet that the spinning of the ceiling fan sounded like someone breathing steadily just above her head. A single glass rolling softly in the kitchen, a bedroom door left slightly ajar, trembling in the wind, or the drip of water from a faucet into the sink, was enough to make everyone in the house unconsciously pause for a second. No one ever said they were afraid. But in families that have been touched by the unseen, fear doesn't need to be named. It lived in the habit of looking toward the door before falling asleep, In the way no one wanted to walk past the bathroom alone too late at night. In how the adults lowered their voices when mentioning Anjang, Chow Duck, or a name that belonged to the dead. Vai's father's side of the family were Muslims, disciplined, private, always strictly observing propriety in how they ate, how they spoke, how they recited scriptures, and how they mentioned the departed. Important matters in the family were never done recklessly. The dead had rituals for the dead, the sick had prayers for the sick. Those traveling far had blessings for safe journeys. Those returning had to be acknowledged in their proper place, with their proper title. From a young age, Vi was used to seeing the adults meticulously maintain these customs, as if believing that as long as they did things right, lived right, called the right names, and stood in the right places, they would be protected from the chaos of the outside world. But the older she got, the more she understood that a family having faith, the scriptures, and rituals did not mean their lineage was devoid of dark corners. There were dark corners found in the prayer room, not under the stairs, not in the room rarely opened. They resided in the way adults fell silent when a certain name was brought up, in the quick darting glance between two elders during a meal, in the heavy sigh when someone mentioned the ancestral house down in Anjang, in the stories told halfway and then abruptly stopped, as if speaking the rest would let the dead hear them. Vi knew of the ancestral house long before she truly understood what ancestral meant. The adults would say, grandfather's house. Then say Aunt Hi's house. Then say, back then we let them stay temporarily. Then say the lawsuit dragged on for so long. Then say, grandmother opened the door and just collapsed. For years those fragmented sentences lay disconnected in V's mind, like tiny pebbles that she didn't yet know where they fell from. It was until she was older that she began stringing them together, realizing that something in her family didn't move in a straight line. It wasn't just an event that happened and ended. 'Twas like a streak of black water, seeping through the years. Sometimes sinking beneath the floor tiles. Sometimes bubbling up as illness. Sometimes manifesting as a laugh in the night. Sometimes wearing the face of a loved one and returning home. The more she listened to the adults tell it, the more Vi felt the story wasn't stuck in the past. It had merely stepped back into the shadows a little, waiting for someone in the house to be weak enough, hurt enough, or careless enough for it to step back out. V's grandfather had been a soldier under the old regime. After 1975 he went overseas. The adult in the family only spoke of it briefly, as if the word went was enough to close the book on a man's life. But for those who stayed behind, that word stretched out into years of missing news, countless nights waiting for a letter, and repeatedly asking acquaintances only to receive shakes of the head in return. At first everyone thought he would get in touch. Maybe there was a paperwork issue. Maybe the mail routes were difficult. Maybe he was waiting to settle down before sending word back. Maybe in a foreign land a man who had lost his country would need time to get back on his feet. 1 year, 2 years, then 10 years passed without a single line of news. No one knew if he was alive or dead. If dead, no one knew where his grave was. If alive, no one understood why he never found his way back. That disappearance wasn't loud, but it weighed down on grandmother like a long shadow. There was no body to cry over. No definitive news to end the waiting. No official death anniversary to finalize the hope. There was only a woman left stranded between two realities, holding the title of a wife, yet living the life of a widow for a very long time. Grandmother was much younger then than she is now, but exhaustion had clung to her early. She had to raise her children, uphold her husband's family's honor, and guard the two ancestral houses down in Anjan as if guarding the last two bones of a man swallowed by the times. One's the house grandfather used to live in. The other belonged to Aunt Hai, his biological sister, located not far away. After he left, grandfather's house was abandoned, the gates were closed, the yard grew wild with weeds, the altar was cold without incense. The roof seeped a little more with each rainy season, the wooden doors warped, the lime peeled from the walls, and a damp, musty smell settled in the living room. A house devoid of people for a long time usually doesn't just deteriorate. It turns cold. That coldness isn't from the wind, but from the absence of human warmth burning inside it. People passing by that house in the late afternoon would often take a quick glance and hurry on. No one said it out loud, but an abandoned house in a small countryside village easily becomes the setting for sinister rumors. On rainy nights, the wind blowing through the crack would make the wooden doors tap lightly against the frames, sounding like someone knocking from the inside. By day, sunlight filtering through the dust in the living room formed milky, white streaks, looking like incense smoke that had died out long ago. One day Aunt Hai came over to speak to grandmother. Her voice at that time, as recounted later, was very soft, very warm, exactly the voice of a caring older sister, talking to her sister-in-law. Listen, it's a shame to leave that house empty. My kids are grown now, about to get married. Why don't you let them stay there temporarily? A little human warmth will keep the house from going cold. Later, whenever you need it, I'll give it back to you. Grandmother was too exhausted at the time to doubt her own flesh and blood. A woman with a missing husband, young children, properties in two places, and relatives on both sides didn't lack foresight. It was just that there were days when merely keeping herself standing took every ounce of strength she had. She figured a vacant house would rot anyway. Having someone watch over it, especially family, was a good thing. Besides, Aunt Hai was her husband's biological sister. A phrase like stay temporarily. A phrase like whenever you need it, I'll give it back. Spoken under the eaves of the ancestral home, in front of the ancestors' altar. What was there to doubt? No paperwork, no signatures. No witnesses other than family members and the spirits on the altar. Later on, whenever she thought back to it, Vi always found that part the most chilling. Not the dark magic. Not the house itself. But the moment a promise was handed over so easily, because the listeners still believed that blood itself was a binding contract. 1 year, 2 years, then 15 years, over 20 years went by. Aunt Hai's children got married, had kids. The child in that house grew up running around the yard that used to be abandoned. They fixed the roof, built a kitchen, planted trees, hung out laundry, laughed, changed the locks, swept the yard, welcomed guests. Rainy seasons passed, the roof was retiled. Sunny seasons passed, the yard was paved with a fresh layer of cement. When visitors came and asked whose house it was, Aunt Hai's children answered as naturally as if the answer had been true from the start. From this house looking in, people only saw a family who had lived there for a very long time. So long that the word temporarily from the past was ground down by the daily grind of life, until the speaker no longer wanted to remember, and the listener could not forget this. As for Vi's grandmother, every time that house was mentioned, it felt like an old bamboo splinter was still wedged in her flesh. At first she held her tongue. Then she began to speak up. She was growing old, grandfather was still missing. Her children and grandchildren all had their own separate lives. She feared that if she laid down in her grave one day and that house was still in someone else's hands, The promise from years ago would die with her. She met with Aunt Hai, speaking gently at first. Sister, back then I let the kid stay there temporarily. Now I'm getting older, I want to take it back to make arrangements for my own children and grandchildren. Aunt Hai was no longer the person who had come to ask for a favor. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was hard. She said they had lived there so long, forcing them to move now would be cruel. She said the house had been abandoned, and it was only because they lived there that it hadn't collapsed. She said her children had spent money fixing it, spent effort maintaining it. She talked in circles, speaking like someone full of moral righteousness, but every single sentence had a hook, hooking the house tighter into her children's hands. There are words that sound very sympathetic on the surface, but underneath lies a very calm usurpation. The more grandmother listened, the more she understood. If she stayed soft, the temporarily from the past would morph into forever, right before her eyes. The lawsuits began. From the day they went to court, it was as if grandmother aged in leaps and bounds. Anything involving land, houses, relatives, and spoken agreements is never clean. Because there was no paperwork from the past, everything dragged on. Grandmother traveled back and forth to Anjiang, sometimes getting a ride, sometimes managing on her own. Aching, she still went. Her back hurting, she still went. Listening to people advise her to just drop, she still went. Someone in the family said, "Come on, what's the point of blood relatives suing each other?" Another said, "They've lived in that house for so many years, how can you demand it back now?" Another spoke softer, though soft words are often more venomous. "She must be fiercely greedy for that house to take it this far." Those words didn't strike her body, but they struck the dignity of a woman who had lost her husband, lost all news of him, lost so much, yet still had to stand tall. Grandmother didn't argue much. She just kept going, because at that point, she was no longer demanding a house back. She was demanding back a promise. In the end, the court ruled in grandmother's favor. The house belonged to her. Aunt Hai's family had to move out. Everyone thought that was the end of it. At worst, sisters wouldn't look at each other. Relatives would be cold. And at future death anniversaries they'd sit far apart and exchange only superficial pleasantries. But there are people who do not accept losing on a piece of paper. They handed the house back with their hands, and kept their resentment alive, through something no one could see. After all the belongings were moved out, Aunt Hai called grandmother. Her voice softened in a strange way. "I've given the house back to you. They've moved everything out. You should go down and take a look now. See if there's any damage, and if there is, tell me so I can send someone fix it." If one didn't know their history, that sentence sounded very reasonable, very kind, even affectionate. And the kinder it is, the less a person has their guard up. Hearing this, grandmother thought it made sense to go see it. A house she hadn't stepped foot in for over 20 years. Now that she had taken it back, she needed to see how it looked, inside and out, how the altar was, whether the walls were damaged. She went alone. In the years to come, no one in Vi's house ever mentioned that trip without lowering their voices. The neighbors around the house recounted that the moment grandmother opened the gate, stepped onto the porch, and reached out to push the front door, she collapsed. She didn't step in and see something. She didn't walk deep into the living room. She didn't smell a strange scent and get dizzy. She simply opened the door. Her entire body crumpled right at the threshold, as if an invisible hand had violently yanked her soul backward out of her flesh. A passerby saw the old woman lying motionless on the floor, panicked. It rushed in to rub medicated oil on her, tugged at her seduced, shouted her name, but she didn't wake up. The door remained ajar behind her. Inside, the house was dark, still devoid of human voices, but later on in Vi's imagination, that door always resembled a mouth that had just taken a bite. A mouth with no teeth, no tongue, but one that knew exactly how to wait for the right person. At first, the hospital down in Anjan said it might be a stroke from a toxic wind. Later, when she was brought up to Saigon, the doctor said it was a cerebrovascular accident made worse by a pre-existing spinal condition. She woke up, but she could no longer speak, could no longer walk. Eating was difficult. Swallowing was hard. She had to be cared for in bed even for going to the bathroom. The house in Saigon, usually still so full of noise, suddenly gained a terrifying silence. The silence of someone desperate to speak but entirely unable to. Vi was still young then, but she vividly remembered her grandmother's eyes. Those eyes weren't the eyes of an ordinary sick person. They weren't just exhausted. They were frantic, panicked. They kept darting back and forth, helpless, as if behind her forehead there was an entire story hammering against her skull, demanding to escape. But someone had clamped her throat shut. There were times Vi stood by the bed leaning down to ask, "Do you want to say something, Grandma?" Grandmother looked at her. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. Her lips trembled, moving for a long time, but she could only force out a choked sound from her throat, so faint it sounded like someone being gagged from very far away. Some days she tried to move her fingers, as if wanting to write on the bed sheets, but her fingers only quivered before falling limp. Some days she stared intently at the bedroom door, tears streaming down her temples, soaking into her hair. No one knew if she was remembering that other house, remembering that other door, or if she was reliving the exact moment something in the darkness slammed violently into her body. Everyone thought it was just the illness. Until a neighbor came to visit, stood looking at grandmother for a long time and suddenly lowered her voice. Has the family considered that maybe she's been hit with black magic? The word magic dropped into the room softly, but it sent a chill down everyone's spine. Vi's family wasn't entirely unfamiliar with hexes and curses, especially being a religious family on the paternal side. They knew about sham magic, about dark spells, about hexing, about people harming one another using things that required no physical touch. But hearing about it in rumors is one thing. Looking at a loved one lying on a bed, their eyes still alive but their body locked away as if paralyzed, is an entirely different matter. Vi's mother sought out Mr. Du. Mr. Du was a man of the same faith, living near the Nguyen Van Lin area, famous for knowing sham magic but only using it to save people, never to harm. He didn't look like Vi's imagination of a sorcerer. No bizarre clothes. No mysterious smiles, no terrifying ominous warnings. He was simple, quiet, his face stern, his eyes deep like someone who had grown used to looking into the things others avoided. When he walked into the house and looked at grandmother for a moment, he didn't ask long questions, he only said, "Yes, that's right, she's cursed, but it can still be broken." The family was both relieved and terrified. Relieved because there was a way to save her. Terrified because if it truly was a curse, it meant someone had intentionally wanted grandmother dead. Or living a half-death. That person wasn't a stranger. Mr. Du didn't say who did it yet. He said he had to break it first. Prep 20 chicken eggs every day. No grand altars, no loud offering ceremonies. No knives, no swords, no ringing bells for the whole neighborhood to hear. Just a single red candle, 20 eggs, closed bathroom, and the sick person on First day, he instructed everyone to help grandmother into the ground floor bathroom. She was wrapped in a thick blanket sitting on a chair. The 20 eggs were placed in front of her. The red candle was lit, its small flame casting a glow against the tiled walls, making grandmother's face look even more ashen and sickly. Mr. D sat opposite her, his mouth mumbling continuously. Everyone else had to step outside. Vi was curious. Children in families where strange things happen often learn fear very early, but they also possess a very deep curiosity. She circled around to the back, pulling herself up to the small bathroom window to peek inside. Through the crack she saw her grandmother sitting motionless in the blanket, her eyes open but not truly looking at anything. Mr. He sat before her, his chanting so soft the words couldn't be made out, blending into a steady, thick stream of sound, like water flowing beneath the floorboards. The 20 eggs lay between them, cold and white, as still as 20 unopened eyes. The red candle dripped wax onto the saucer, each drop congealing like clotted blood. In that small room, the light didn't make things any less terrifying. It only highlighted grandmother's absolute stillness. After hanging there for a while, V's arms ached. She sat down and waited outside. The house was uncommonly quiet then. No one spoke loudly. V's mother kept pacing in and out, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. Relatives sat out in the living room, some with heads bowed, some checking their watches, some occasionally glancing toward the bathroom door, as if terrified that a sound not belonging to Mr. Du would emerge from within. About an hour later the door opened. Mr. Du told them to guide grandmother out to bed. Then he called Vi over and pointed at the floor. Girl, sweep up everything on the floor and throw it away. Don't throw it out inside the house. Don't throw it near the house. Go very far away, dump it next to some wall. Later, when your grandmother is well again, don't ever let her step on these things. Vi grabbed the dustpan and walked in, and froze. The bathroom floor was covered in crushed eggshells. There were no egg whites, no egg yolks, only shells. Shattered fragments, stark white under the light, lay mixed with countless tiny pebbles, like the gravel you put in an aquarium, gray, white, brown, black, scattered across the floor as if someone had just pulled them out from beneath a person's skin. Vi looked around. The 20 eggs had been perfectly intact at the start. The door had been sealed shut. No one had brought gravel inside. So where did those pebbles come from? She didn't dare ask. She swept. As she swept, she caught a very faint metallic stench. It wasn't the smell of eggs. It wasn't the smell of blood. It smelled like earth that had been soaked in stagnant water. For a long time the smell of an old clay jar opened after many years. The dustpan filled up quickly, becoming unnaturally heavy. The tiny pebbles scraped against each other, with a gritty crunching sound. That sound, years later, whenever she heard someone pouring gravel, heard eggshells cracking, heard any small seed drop onto a bathroom floor, Vi would still remember it. She took it very far away to dump, nearly a kilometer, next to an unfamiliar wall, exactly as Mr. Du instructed. When she flipped the dustpan over, the shells and pebbles spilled out with a crunch. Vi stood looking at them for a moment, feeling deep down that she wasn't just throwing away trash, but was carrying a piece of illness, a piece of venomous resentment, a piece of whatever had been nesting inside her grandmother, out of the house. She didn't dare kick them with her foot, didn't dare touch them again. The second the dustpan was empty, she walked away very fast, but after a few steps, she had the creeping sensation that behind her back there was still a very faint gritty sound, as if those pebbles were grinding against each other all on their own. 7 consecutive days, 20 eggs every single day, the red candle every day, the closed bathroom every day. Mr. does muffled chanting behind the door every day. And every day, swept up eggshells, tiny pebbles, to throw far away. The first day there were many pebbles, the second day still many, but the stench was fainter. On the third day, grandmother managed to swallow a few spoonfuls of porridge. On the fourth day her eyes found focus when looking at people in the house, no longer darting around wildly as if trapped in a nightmare. On the fifth day she managed to lift her arm. On the sixth day her lips forced out a few dry, croaking sounds, unclear words, but enough to make wise mother burst into tears. By the seventh day she babbled her first few syllables like someone surfacing from underwater, their lungs still thick with mud. After another week she practiced taking slow, deliberate steps like a child learning to walk all over again. The whole family wept with joy, but that joy wasn't clean. It was stained with fear. Because no one could forget the pebbles that had fallen out of that locked room. When everyone asked who did it, Mr. D stayed quiet for a moment before answering. Someone in the family, not a stranger. The curse was placed right at the ancestral home down in the countryside. The moment the door opened she was struck. Later he elaborated. The one who cast it wasn't Aunt Hai directly, but the husband of Aunt Hai's eldest child, a man with roots in Phnom Penh, who knew the venomous black magic from across the border. They had handed the house back with their hands, but planted death right at the threshold. No need to stab, no need to curse out loud, no need to face her. They only needed to let an old woman believe she was stepping into her own home. From then on, in the guy's mind, this ancestral house in Anjiang was no longer a house. It had become a mouth, and her grandmother was the one who had opened it. The terrifying part was, after grandmother was saved, life didn't magically transition to bright colors. People still ate their meals, still went to work, still laughed and talked, still occasionally forgot the past to keep living. Grandmother learned to walk again, talk again, sit in the living room like before, but some things never returned completely intact. Sometimes while sitting, she would suddenly stare out the door for a very long time. Sometimes if someone accidentally mentioned Aunt Hai's name, her hand would freeze over her ice bowl. There were not. I woke up to get water and saw grandmother sitting alone under the yellow light, her eyes wide open staring at the door, as if she could still hear the sound of the door in Anjiang swinging open in her head. She couldn't fully recount what she had seen the moment she collapsed. Or maybe she could, but didn't want to. Every time someone pressed deeper, she just fell silent. That silence made the story infinitely heavier than any words could. There are wounds that stop bleeding, yet still make a person flinch every time they hear a door creak. Which is why years later, when Uncle Fat began showing his first symptoms, the first ones to feel a chill down their spines weren't the shamans nor outsiders, but those who had seen grandmother lying on that bed with eyes begging to be saved. No one said outright, "It must be dark magic again," but there were sentences that didn't need to be spoken to manifest in everyone's hearts. The thing that had once been planted at the threshold of the ancestral home didn't necessarily have to stay there. It could follow people back to Saigon through memory, through terror, through names that remained unforgiven. It could lie dormant in the house for years, waiting for another tragedy to surface. Uncle Fat was Vi's biological uncle, tall, handsome, dashing, a man who had always been deeply dedicated to his business. He lived with Aunt Dim in Long An, where they opened a roadside coffee shop. In the mornings, the shop hummed with the sound of motorbikes pulling in, spoons clinking in glass cups, customers calling out for iced black or iced milk, ice shattering in the cooler, water boiling, and Jim chatting with the regulars. Life wasn't luxurious, but it was steady. It wasn't that the couple never argued, it wasn't that there were no days when money was tight, but it was the steady rhythm of a family living by their own hands. Uncle Fat used to be the kind of man that made heads turn when he stepped out at the door, not just for his looks but for his confident stride, his articulate way of speaking, and the sheer vitality in his eyes. Aunt Dim was used to a husband like that, waking up to help with the shop in the morning, calculating the register at noon, fixing a light bulb in the afternoon, sitting and drinking tea on the porch at night. Not perfect but real. Everything started after he ran into an ex-girlfriend returning from America. She had loved him years ago, then they broke up, and she went overseas, got married. On one of her trips back to Vietnam, old friends gathered to eat and drink. Uncle Fat came up from Long An to Saigon to meet them. If that were all, no one would have thought much of it. A man meets an old friend, has a few drinks, talks about the past, shares a few laughs, and everyone goes home. But after that time he changed. At first it was heavy drinking every single day. When he'd drop by grandmother's house in Saigon, still reeking of alcohol, he would just laugh and say work was just full, he was just drinking for fun. Grandmother scolded him, he just smiled. V still remembers the time when grandmother looked at him for a very long time, her eyes darkening slightly. Not just out of anger over her son's drinking, but as if she caught a fleeting glimpse right behind his silhouette of something that had once stood at the door of the Ancestral home years ago. People who have been cursed can sometimes recognize the scent of malicious magic very early on, even if they can't prove it. It doesn't smell like incense, doesn't smell like herbs, but it alters the air around a person. As if someone had just swapped their soul out for a clumsy replica. Then he vanished for a week. In Long An, Aunt DM frantically made calls everywhere while trying to run the coffee shop. Every time the phone went unanswered, she would look out at the road. The pavement glaring stark white under the midday sun, cars rushing past, dust settling on the plastic tables and chairs. When customers asked where Uncle Fat was, she would force a smile and say he was out on business. But inside something was clawing at her, inch by inch. A husband might go out drinking all night, might be mad at his wife for a few days, but disappearing for a week, no words, no news. That was no longer just about having fun. At night she couldn't sleep soundly. Every time she heard a motorbike on the street, she would sit up and look. There were times she was so angry she wanted to lock the door and refuse to let him in. Other times she was terrified that if some terrible had actually happened to him, her anger would be completely unjustified. The agony of the one left behind is not knowing whether to be angry or worried, whether to cry or to scream. One afternoon the sun was glaring, blending like white off the pavement. A car pulled up to the shop. Uncle Fat stepped out. Aunt Dim was standing behind the counter, a stirring spoon in her hand. He walked in, his face frighteningly normal, as if he had just left the house that morning. As if he hadn't been missing for a week. As if there wasn't a wife inside who had lost sleep, sick with worry. He said, "Make me 2 coffees to go." No explanation, no asking how she was, no trace of guilt, not a single "I'm home." Aunt Dim stood frozen for a few seconds. "Where have you been gone an entire week? Now you come back and demand 2 coffees. What is this?" He only smiled. That smile made her run cold. It wasn't the smile of someone joking around, nor the smile of a guilty man. It looked like the smile of someone hearing a question from very far away with no part left inside them lucid enough to answer. She made the 2 coffees. Her hands shook, but she made them. The ice clinked as it hit the glass. The black coffee dripped down into the thick condensed milk, turning a dense dark brown. He carried them out to the car. She followed him out, her intuition screaming that something was deeply wrong. In the passenger seat a woman was sitting. That woman leaned over and wrapped her arms around his arm, clinging to him right in front of her eyes, overly intimate as if she deliberately wanted the real wife to see. No avoiding it. No embarrassment. No hiding. Aunt Dim screamed, "Where are you going?" Uncle Fat turned back, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm going to Chodak for a trip." Then the car drove off. Aunt Dim stood in the middle of the shop's courtyard, her hands sticky with coffee, watching the car slowly disappear. The customers in the shop were dead silent. No one dared to ask. There are humiliations that, if they happen behind closed doors, you can at least shut the door and cry. But if they happen in front of strangers, they stick to your skin much longer. She called grandmother in Saigon. Her voice wasn't just angry, it was terrified. On the other end of the line, grandmother stayed quiet for a very long time. Perhaps in her mind at that moment, the door to the ancestral home swung open once again. Perhaps she remembered those tiny pebbles on the bathroom floor. A week later Uncle Fat returned, but he didn't go to Long An first. He went back to grandmother's house in Saigon. His face was completely vacant, his gait stumbling like a drunk, yet there was no smell of alcohol. Whenever anyone asked anything, he gave brief, dismissive answers. His eyes were emptied, like a house that someone else had moved into, but the rightful owner hadn't yet realized they'd lost their place. Grandmother called Aunt Dickim up and asked Vi's mother to invite Mr. Do over. Mr. Do arrived, took one look at him, and initially said there was no curse. He didn't see any black magic. The family felt a temporary wave of relief, but Aunt Dim had no peace. A wife who has lived with her husband long enough knows exactly when his silence is no longer just exhaustion. He sat there in front of everyone. At times she saw him acting as if he were listening to someone speaking from behind his back. His eyes would occasionally dart to an empty corner of the room, then snap back. When she asked, he said it was nothing. But that nothing was so hollow it made everyone listening profoundly uneasy. Half a year later the signs became undeniable. Uncle Fat started sitting constantly on the wooden armrest of the living room sofa, refusing to sit properly on the cushion. The armrest was barely 50 or 60 centimeters high, yet he would perch there precariously, swaying back and forth, his eyes devoid of life, occasionally chuckling to himself. The Aunt Dim would glance in while tending the coffee shop, annoyed. "Get down and sit properly, you'll fall and break your neck sitting like that." He smiled, didn't reply. Once, right in front of her eyes, he toppled backward off the armrest onto the floor. It wasn't a high fall, but when she pulled up his shirt, his entire back was already bruised, pitch black like the skin of a sweet potato, spreading so rapidly it looked like something beneath his flesh had just hatched. He cried in pain all night, claimed it stopped hurting the next day, but the massive bruise remained. A few days later he was sitting on the armrest again, a cigarette in one hand, a lighter in the other, failing to light it over and over. His body swayed wildly back and forth. Then, as if an invisible hand had gripped his throat and violently yanked, he crashed to the floor a second time. This time 2 or 3 people rushed in to pull him up, but they couldn't get him into a sitting position. He lay on the ground, still holding his cigarette and lighter, lying on his side smoking the cigarette to the head in and as if lying on the floor were perfectly normal. After that his torso snapped upright, fell flat like a roly-poly toy a cruel child had grown tired of, and violently hurled to the floor. When he finished smoking he crawled. Didn't stand up. Didn't sit up. He crawled from the living room into the bedroom, elbows scraping against the floor tiles, back arched, head bowed low, looking far more like an injured animal than the tall, dashing man he used to be. At that moment Aunt Diana remembered grandmother. Not a memory in words, a memory in her skin. Remembering the feeling of an entire family standing around the bed of a paralyzed loved one, completely lost as to who had done what. He was brought to Saigon. Mr. Du looked at him a second time for a very long while, then said, "God help us, he is cursed. But it's weak, it can be broken." He told them to prepare 4 trays of food and to invite respected elder men of their faith to come and chant. 4 trays, 4 men to a tray. 16 voices chanting sutras sank heavily into the house, draping over Uncle Fat like layer upon layer of freezing water. After hours of agonizing struggle, he finally fell asleep. A week or 2 later he recovered. Everyone thought it was over. But malicious magic doesn't always disappear immediately. It retreats into a deeper corner, lying as still as a snake coiled beneath a bed. Half a year later he changed again. One night Aunt Dim woke up to a strange noise. Uncle Fat had sat up, walked into the bathroom, taken off his own pajama pants and put on his young daughter's floral pants. The next morning he asked her in pure panic why she had dressed him in floral pants. She recounted what happened. He remembered absolutely nothing. Another time in the dead of night he took off the pants he was wearing and told her to get him another pair because some little girl keeps demanding these pants. She says these are hers. Hearing that sent a violent chill down her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm and fetched him another pair. There are times when the living don't dare to react strongly, terrified that the thing burrowing their loved one's mouth will realize they are afraid. Then came the morning Aunt Diem's own mother came to visit, walking in to see him grabbing the mosquito net, blankets, mats and pillows, throwing all of them out into the yard. She yelled, "What on earth are you doing, Fat?" He spun around, his face deathly pale, his eyes bloodshot like someone who had just witnessed hell inside his own bedroom. "Don't you see them, Mom? There are little kids on the bed. They're jumping around like crazy. They're tearing their own stomachs open, pulling out their guts and stuffing them into the pillowcases. It's nothing but blood. Don't you see?" Aunt Diem ran in, staring at a completely empty bed. But he kept pointing, screaming in sheer terror, claiming the pillowcases were stuffed with children's intestines, that the blankets were drenched in blood. A man wasn't being murdered, but he was being humiliated in front of his wife, in front of his mother-in-law, in front of his neighbors. Dark magic doesn't just torture the flesh. It Lothi strips away a person's right to be looked upon by their loved ones the same way ever again. When Aunt Im called Saigon, grandmother didn't ask a string of questions. Perhaps she had been waiting for this call for a long time, ever since the first time he walked into the house with soulless eyes. This time he refused to go see Mr. Du. Aunt Dim had to trick him into going to Binchan for a drive. Then took a detour back to grandmother's house. Sitting in the back of the vehicle he knew. He just kept whispering. "This road goes back to mother's house, doesn't it? Please don't go to mother's house. Honey, let's go back. Don't stay here anymore. No thrashing, no screaming," just repeating it over and over as if someone inside him were borrowing his mouth to negotiate. When Mr. The walked-in uncle fell dead silent. That silence was more terrifying than any resistance. Mr. Doe said the curse was still there. Last time they had only stripped away the surface. This time, they had to prepare 7 trays and the only meat dish allowed was snakehead fish. The family cooked snakehead fish thick noodle soup, inviting the respected elders of their faith to chant. That day fell on a Friday, a holy day. The chanting stretched from afternoon into evening. Steady, profound, heavy, washing through the house, wave after wave. Uncle Fat lay perfectly still, sweat soaking his shirt. At times his face turned stark white. At times his lips moved as if trying to say something but no sound came out. At times his fingers curled, scraping lightly against the woven mat, a tiny sound but one that sent a chill straight up Aunt Dim's spine as she stood nearby. A few days later he fully regained his senses. Mr. Duke confirmed that the one who cast the hex was the ex-girlfriend. During that trip to Chowdak, she had slipped the curse into him. He survived. But Aunt Dim never slept deeply again. Whenever he sat at the edge of the bed for too long, she watched him. Whenever he tossed and turned in the middle of the night, she woke up. Whenever a child laughed too loudly near the bedroom, she would see that empty bed materialize, along with his voice saying, "They're tearing their own stomachs open, pulling out their guts, and stuffing them into the pillowcases." Vi was still young then, but she began to understand that these things didn't move in a straight line. It wasn't just grandmother's ordeal, finishing and then moving on to Uncle Fat. It wasn't one isolated incident followed by another. It was like a streak of black water seeping from the threshold of the ancestral house into their bloodline, bleeding through one person, and just when you thought it had dried up, it materialized in someone else, taking a different shape, a different voice, an entirely different method of torture. And then Aunt Sop passed away. In 2019, at 10 o'clock at night, so suddenly that the house didn't even have time to brace itself for grief. Aunt So in Vi's memory wasn't a ghost. Before she died she was a very vivid living person, possessing a distinct voice, a specific way of laughing, a habit of calling Vi's mother Chiba, a familiar way of walking through the gate, her own private joys and sorrows, the children, her husband, and exhaustion she didn't always voice completely. Her death came too fast, like a hand violently yanking off the lights while everyone was still mid-conversation. According to Vi's family's religion, the deceased had to be buried very quickly, within 24 hours before sunset. No prolonged mourning periods, no keeping the corpse in the house for days on end. The living had to do it right, do it fast, do it thoroughly. That night the house in Saigon operated in a state of orderly panic, calling the religious elders, the first round of chanting, washing the body, shrouding the corpse and preparing to transport her back to Chowdak in the dead of night. At 1 or 2 in the morning the convoy set off. The entire group traveled in sheer exhaustion, wrapped in the smell of incense amidst stifled sobs. The night road was long. The headlights swept across dark stretches of highway, across rows of trees, across rest stops. No one fell completely asleep. Everyone felt suspended between wakefulness and a trance, arriving in Anjiang more chanting. A final purification with agarwood incense, then out to the cemetery for burial in the early afternoon. Everything happened so fast. So fast that the agony of the living didn't even have time to take shape before it was swept away by the rituals. The living hadn't even had time to truly believe the person lying there was dead before the dirt was shoveled over her. After the funeral, the family temporarily rented a few rooms in a motel located within a garden cafe to rest. Everyone was dead on their feet. Grandmother was elderly, so she slept in a room by herself. Vi's mother, Viansa's husband and a few others sat together in another room talking. No one could form a coherent conversation, just fragmented sentences. So tired. We'll leave early tomorrow. Was so crowded this afternoon. Poor kids. Mentioning a few things then falling silent. At first the atmosphere was simply sorrowful and drained. Then a faint fragrance drifted in. Just a hint. Like someone had just walked past the door. But the door didn't open. No one walked past. The scent didn't waft in from the outside. It rose from the very center of the circle of people sitting there. Agarwood incense. Exactly the same agarwood incense they had just used to purify Ansa's corpse before burial. The scent grew heavier by the second, thick, warm yet freezing cold. It draped over their hair, their clothes, their hands, the very breath of everyone in the room. No one spoke the first word. Because to speak it out loud meant acknowledging that there was an extra person in the room. The person they had just buried that afternoon. His mother sat perfectly still. He looked at Ansa's husband. Ansa's husband stared down at the floor. Someone else raised a hand to cover their nose, then immediately dropped it, as if terrified the gesture would be seen as disrespectful to the dead. The scent grew overwhelmingly dense. There was a palpable sensation that someone was sitting right in the middle of their circle, her hair still damp with the smell of smoke, quietly listening to them speak her name. Suddenly, someone bolted up and ran for the door. The entire group panicked and ran after them. That night no one dared to sleep in that room again. 5 people crammed into another room, lying pressed together like terrified children, while grandmother slept alone, no one daring to tell her lest she be frightened. But while the scent of agarwood materialized in Anjang, something else was happening in Saigon. The convoy traveling back from Anjang broke down at the Vamkong Bridge, forcing them to wait 2 or 3 hours for replacement vehicles. The house in Saigon was completely empty. Doors locked, lights out. The house sat dead still in the alley. Across the street lived Mrs. Ba, a close neighbor. Unable to sleep that night, she went out to her balcony to catch the breeze. Around 11 or 12 at night she saw Ansao walking in from the alley, a familiar gait, not hurried, not slow. Ansao stood before the gate, opened it, walked in, then opened the front door and stepped inside. No lights were turned on, no sound of keys, no sound of doors. Mrs. Ba didn't know she had died, so she only found it strange that the house was so dark, but she wasn't scared. The next morning when the whole family returned, she came over and asked, "I saw Ha come back first yesterday. Why are you all just getting back now?" And from that question Aunt Asa's death no longer rested peacefully in the Shodak cemetery. After that Aunt Sap came back many times, but she didn't return with blood-curdling screams. She didn't manifest as a bloody apparition. She didn't terrorize the children. She returned in details so minuscule that if you didn't live in that house, you would just assume you misheard. One evening Vice swept the floor, then went out to the yard to chat with the neighbors. Vi's mother was in the ground floor bathroom, heard rustling in the living room, assumed it was Vi, and called out, Vi, remember to lock the doors properly before you go to sleep, honey." Instantly a voice replied, "Yes, I know, Chiba." That voice wasn't Vi. Vi's mother froze. Inside the bathroom the harsh white light suddenly felt freezing cold. The drip of water from the faucet to the floor echoed clearly, drop by drop. Her mother sat perfectly still, her hands turning ice cold, her throat tight. At that moment the only people in the house were grandmother, Vi, her brother, and her mother. No one ever called Vi's mother Chiba in that exact voice, in that exact tone, except Anso when she was alive. Mother stepped out. Vi was still out in the yard, talking with the neighbors, completely oblivious to her having called out from that day on. Every time she walked past the wall-floor bathroom at night, Vi's mother always walked just a little bit faster. Another time after Ansau's mother-in-law passed away, Vidro drove Ansau's 2 children back to Longkan to see their paternal grandmother one last time. The house in Saigon was left with only grandmother, V's mother, and her brothers. Grandmother was lying in her room dozing off when she heard a clattering sound, like someone rummaging through things. She opened her eyes. There was a silhouette in the room. The shadow bent down, searching for something very hurriedly, its hands touching the closet, touching the belongings, making faint noises. Grandmother assumed Vi had come back to grab something, so she asked, "Oh, what are you looking for, Vi?" The shadow darted out immediately, but in the split second her eyes adjusted to the dark, she realized that silhouette wasn't Vi. It was Aunt Sao. Grandmother panicked so badly her blood pressure spiked, calling for V's mother to run downstairs. When her mother arrived, grandmother was still trembling. Sao came back. She must have heard the news about her mother-in-law dying, so she came back looking for something. The dead sometimes don't do anything inherently terrifying. It is their very familiarity that chills the living to the bone. A silhouette in a room. An answer using the exact right name. A scent of agarwood. A soundless door. V was the last one to encounter her, during a time when she had just survived a severe illness. She thought she wouldn't make it through. After her hospital stay, she was brought home. No longer needing a ventilator, but her body was frail. Her lungs were breathing on their own, yet feeling like they had to relearn every single breath. The people who have just narrowly escaped a massive illness often feel as though the world has grown thinner. The lights in the house are bright, but lack substance. The voices of loved ones sound distant. The shadows at the back of the room are no longer just ordinary darkness, but feel like the very place you just turned your back on. That night, the house was empty. Vi lay on the floor on her familiar mattress, her eyes half open, half shut. Her body was so exhausted she didn't want to move. The ceiling fan spun overhead, far away the sound of motorbikes in the alley. The house sank into a very delicate silence. Suddenly she heard a laugh, not loud, not close, but incredibly clear. A woman's laugh, short, soft, so familiar that Vi's scalp went cold before her memory could even attach a name to it. She opened her eyes and looked toward the back of the house. No one was there. The laugh rang out a second time, as if coming from the stairs, and then faded. Vi lay perfectly still. She didn't call out for her mother. Didn't call for anyone, because she knew that if she called out and yes answered her back from an empty space, she wouldn't be able to survive it. After that night, Vi no longer believed that when people died they were gone completely. Some of the dead still drop by. Not to haunt, not to drag anyone away. Sometimes they just return out of habit. Through a scent still lingering in their hair. Through a familiar reply spoken on reflex. Through a silhouette darting out of a room. Through a quiet laugh when a living loved one has just barely escaped death. As if they were standing somewhere very close. Watching the people in the house continue to live. Unsure whether to be happy or sad. And when she strung it all together, Vi realized her family didn't have 3 separate stories. It wasn't grandmother's story. It wasn't Uncle Fat's story. It wasn't Aunt Sa's story. It was all just one single current of darkness flowing through the years, shifting shapes as it passed by each person. For grandmother it was the door to the ancestral house and the pebbles falling out of the eggs. For Uncle Fat it was the body of a man being jerked like puppet, the crawling silhouette on the tiles, the empty bed he saw soaked in blood. For Aunt Sal it was the scent of agar wood in the middle of the room, the phrase, "Yes I know, Chiba." A shadowy figure opening the door and stepping into the house when she was supposed to be resting beneath the earth. The house in Saigon continued to live on. By day there was still the sound of the iron gate, the bubbling pot of water, the slap of sandals, the voices calling out, but I no longer heard those sounds the old way. She listened to the void hiding right behind them. Listened to hear if within the sound of running water there was the crunch of crushed eggshells. Listen to hear if within the sound of someone walking through the living room there was a painstakingly slow crawling rhythm. Listen to see if the smell of incense on the altar would suddenly turn into the thick, overwhelming scent of agar wood from the day they took Ansa to be buried. Years later, whenever night fell, if there was the faint sound of something dropping lightly in the house, they would still unconsciously look toward the door. Not because she was hoping to see someone, nor entirely because she was terrified of seeing someone, but because when things have stepped into her family, through a threshold, through a hex, through a scent, through a familiar call, it becomes very hard to believe that they have ever truly left. In the dead of night, when the entire house was so quiet you could hear the ceiling fan spinning, Vice sometimes imagined she could hear the crunch of eggshells on the bathroom floor. Then the sound of a man crawling agonizingly slowly across the living room. Then the scent of agar wood thickening in the empty air. And finally the sound of a door opening without making a sound. Stepping into the dark, as if it had never left at all.